Welcome to Renewal Cast. We are going to take a break in our study of the Pilgrim's Progress this week because we have a special guest with us. Dr. James Dolezal is with us, and we're going to talk about the simplicity of God today. Dr. Dolezal, will you just take a few minutes and share with us a little bit about yourself and your ministry and your family? We'd like to get to know you a little bit.
Thank you, gentlemen, for having me on. Really honored to be on here with you. I have, for the last many years, been teaching on the faculty at Cairn University, the School of Divinity at Cairn University in Langhorne, Pennsylvania, and continue to teach on that faculty. I'm also engaged full-time currently at Radius Theological Institute in Bakersfield, California, where I direct our institute and teach most of our theology courses. The goal of Radius, we're not a degree granting institution. The university is, the institute is not, but we really cover core areas of Christian doctrine. Every semester we have a 12-week fall term, a 12-week spring term, in which we do 5 courses covering core areas of Christian doctrine. So doctrine of God, Christ, man, sin, and salvation are the courses I teach, and then other professors come in and teach surveys of church history and also overviews of biblical theology, and so that's where I'm engaged full-time currently.
Excellent.
Where do you live at then? You live in?
Currently living in Bakersfield, California.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
We won't hold that against you. The California thing.
That's all right. I'm new to the town, so I'm not, I'm not a native.
Yeah, we know some really good people from Bakersfield area. So, well, let's jump into this a little bit. When we talk about classical Christian theism, that's something that's been thrown around a lot today. What do we mean by that?
Yeah, the title or the little name, the label classical Christian theism is obviously of recent vintage. Things don't become classical until a long time later, retrospectively. And so that's a nickname that we have given a certain set of theological elements that we find really broadly throughout the history of the church, East and West. And it particularly focuses on certain commitments within the doctrine of God or theology proper, and particularly with regard to certain attributes, or maybe what we'll talk about today, the way in which we speak about God having his attributes. And so these would be doctrines like divine aseity, that God is perfectly self-sufficient, or independent would have been an older way of saying it, that God does not require anything not himself for any aspect of his being or life, that God is the reason for God. I think maybe if you want to get down to the hard core of classical Christian theism, it is a resolute commitment to God being the reason for God, and then a lot of the kind of attending attributes tend to, in a certain sense, flow out of that commitment. So aseity, I mean, that's just a Latinized term. Ase means that God is of himself or from himself, that God is the reason for God, so that God does not look outside of himself for some kind of causal ground or source, nor does God, in a certain sense, look within himself for principles or causes of being that are more fundamental than God himself. And so maybe we can talk, so that kind of leads to the doctrine of divine simplicity, that God is not composed of parts. The older writers, the classical Christian theists down the ages, and by classical Christian theists, I mean, there are moderns who are classical Christian theists. Herman Bavinck was died in the 21st century, and his Reformed Dogmatics is very much within the sort of orbit of classical Christian theism. The same thing with guys like Louis Berkhoff. Interestingly, if I can kind of push outside of the Reformed tradition a little bit, you're going to find certain sort of core aspects of classical Christian theism in the early 17th century, late 16th century in James Arminius, though Calvinists will obviously want to debate on certain issues of free will. But you'll also find aspects of this even in a dispensationalist theologian like Louis Sperry Chafer. When you read Louis Sperry Chafer, he believes that God is independent and self-sufficient, and even argues he's not composed of parts. And when we say classical, we don't just mean old, but a certain old way of thinking that may be contemporary as well, and certainly it is. Maybe additionally to this, doctrines like divine impassibility, that God is without passions, is another area of classical Christian theism that once upon a time was virtually held universally by the church, north, south, east, west. Nowadays, sounds sort of awkward to the modern ears to hear that God is passionless. When I taught this to my undergraduate students for years, I would always introduce my lecture on divine impassibility, telling them that I had to deliver the good news that God was not passionate about them at all. And that didn't mean he didn't care. In fact, what it really meant was that he cared perfectly, which is even better than passionately. But that's maybe a different subdivision of classical Christian theism. Also, doctrines maybe more familiar like divine immutability, that God is not a subject who undergoes change. That God, another way of saying this in kind of a sloganized way would be that God is being, not becoming. I like to say God is I am, not I am plus I'm not yet. That there's a fullness and a plenitude of being. Doctrines like divine infinity, real boundless positivity of being that is not in the process of being actualized. These are ways of describing that divine absoluteness that really lies at the core of classical Christian theism. Now, as far as advocates, we find advocates for this really everywhere historically that Christianity went. You would find leading theologians and even church doctrinal statements affirming pieces or in toto these aspects that we call classical Christian theism. So Athanasius of Alexandria in northern Africa is going to affirm that God is without parts and without passions and unchangeable, and he'll say those sorts of things repeatedly. If you move a little to the west and a century later, a little more than, you'll find Augustine of Hippo in also North Africa saying the same sorts of things quite frequently in his book on the Trinity, the De Trinitata. If you want to move kind of back over into the western side of Asia, you're going to find church fathers like John of Damascus also affirming these things quite resolutely. Pseudo-Dionysius a little later as well. Boethius as well. If you want to really push the clock forward, you can go to the 11th. You can go to the 11th and 12th century and point to someone like Anselm of Canterbury, or you can sort of move down onto the into the Italian peninsula and point to someone like Thomas Aquinas, or to Bonaventure in the 13th century. So that it's really these sort of commitments that God is not composed of parts and isn't subject to passions and is immutable and is perfectly self-sufficient in his being and life. You're going to find this commitment very broad, very, very much to the east, the west, the north, and the south, sort of down the creek. And it cuts across even the traditional divisions that eventually emerge within Christendom. You're going to find this in Eastern Orthodox fathers and theologians. You're going to find this in Western and later medieval Catholic theologians. But then it's going to pass over virtually unaltered into all branches of the Protestant tradition as well. And I think this is I'm trying to sketch this out historically only to say this is what warrants the name classical. That this is not a set of sectarian doctrines that we can sort of trace through a very narrow line of the faithful. This is actually a very broad line of the faithful that cuts east to west, Protestant to Catholic. As I mentioned earlier, even if you read someone like James Arminius, who was trained in Geneva, Switzerland, under Theodore Beza at sort of Calvin's academy there. there are commitments even in Arminius that he holds fast to, like impassibility and simplicity and immutability, right through his career. His doctrine of man and human free will notwithstanding, his doctrine of God sort of holds on to these. Interestingly, you'll find them in, and then the Protestant tradition proliferates into all sorts of branches, and so it'd be very difficult to trace it. But you're going to find an 18th century Baptist like John Gill, and century Presbyterian like Matthew Henry, and an 18th century father of Methodism like John Wesley. And you read John Wesley's commentaries, and very clearly he is solidly committed to classical Christian theism. So I think the thing I'd want to emphasize with this label is that this label is not picking out some kind of boutique or sectarian or minority group position down the ages of the church, that you're going to find this really broadly through Christendom, not only in its theologians, but also in its doctrinal statements. And so you'll find the Fourth Lateran Council will say that God is simple. The First Vatican Council of the 19th century will say that God is simple. But then if you read the Belgic Confession, a Protestant confession of the 16th century, the first thing it says is that we need to believe that God is a simple spirit. And that's the first thing it says that we're supposed to say. The 39 Articles of the Church of England, 15, now my date escapes me. I want to say 63, but it could be 62. The first thing is the Lord our God is without body, immaterial, parts, that is to say composite, and passions. The Lord our God is without body, parts, or passions. And then it proceeds to speak more about his perfections and immutability. So Anglicanism, Methodism, which is a later branch out of Anglicanism, Baptist, Arminian, Calvinist, Lutheran scholastics, Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, very broadly committed to this. And I guess I want to say, if anything ever had claimed to be a truly ecumenical heritage of the church, what we now nickname classical Christian theism would really have rights to that claim. Nevertheless, and I can put a ellipsis, ... Nevertheless, so much of that commitment over the last maybe 200 to 300 years has begun to be sort of hollowed out for various reasons, I suppose. But anyway, that's my bird's eye view on sort of what are these core doctrines and kind of where do you find them? And they're just ubiquitous. They're really ubiquitous in the Christian tradition. You look over your shoulder and there they are. And in the mouth of any conceivable theologian who bears the name Christian is going to say something like this. At least it was that way once upon a time, and it's still that way in areas of Christendom today, for sure.
But you're alluding to something. Has it fallen on hard times in evangelicalism today?
Yeah, it has, and
okay.
It's tempting to say, well, that's what liberalism does. Liberalism hollows out anything like talk about the divine being. Liberalism in the late 19th century really turned Christianity into ethics, more or less. Basically, being a good neighbor became what Christendom was all about. And I'm more than willing to point the finger at liberalism and say they're kind of anti-metaphysical, anti-transcendent, sort of ethics-driven interpretation of the Christian faith. Certainly has a role to play, but it would be disingenuous to suggest that is the sole source or even the primary source of this erosion, why we've lost hold of this. Now, let me say a little bit. I don't want to suggest that it's been wholly lost entirely in a lot of Protestant. First of all, it's alive. Well, I'll say it this way. I don't know if it's well. I was going to say alive and well. Maybe I should just say alive and in some places well among modern Roman Catholics, but they are obligated by their own tradition if they're faithful to their tradition. Vatican I obliges them to hold classical Christian theism against modernity. Vatican I is an anti-modernist document. Much of what it says on the doctrine of God looks exactly like what Protestants were saying in the 16th and 17th century. Which looks a lot like what Catholics were saying in the 13th century. So there's something about a lot of the doctrine of God in Vatican I that kind of keeps it alive within Roman Catholicism as part of that anti-modernist agenda of the late 19th, early 20th century. So it's certainly there. If you read modern 20th century Roman Catholics like Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange or Etienne Gisson, you're going to find these doctrines alive and well. But you can also read the Second London Confession of a bunch of Baptists in the 17th century and find the exact same commitment. So I want to submit that it's not just Roman Catholicism, and even there, it's not universal. I mean, they debate with each other, and there are certainly modernist and anti-classical forces at work. It wouldn't be accurate to say it's homogenous. But also within Protestantism, it remains and holds on, particularly in the language of our confessions. So if you take the Belgic Confession or the Second London Confession, which the Belgic says that God is simple, the Second London and the Westminster Confession, the Savoy Declaration, the 39 Articles of Religion for the Church of England, all say the Lord our God is without body, parts, or passions, and then go on to detail his infinite plenitude of being and his self-sufficiency. And so insofar as Protestants have kind of held on to the language of 16th and 17th century confessions, the concepts of classical Christian theism sort of get sustained by that confessionalism. Although I think we should perhaps be careful and a little realistic that having the language, and I'll just speak for myself in my own career here, having the language and having a firm grasp on the concepts behind the language aren't necessarily the same thing. I think that I had the language of classical Christian theism in my hands years before I had really wrestled with the conceptual implications of what those confessions meant. So I think that our traditions have kept these ideas alive theologically, and we've had to, maybe like every new generation, go back to our sources and to our foundations and reinvestigate and really test all things by whether indeed these things are so. We need to test them by natural revelation. We need to test them by special revelation. We need to see whether God would have us believe these things about himself. So there's a certain sense in which classical Christian theism, I think we need to be careful of taking it for granted. It very wonderfully gets passed on to us in our confessional language, but there is a certain sense in which to make a confession of faith from the heart or to subscribe to an historic Reformed confession, for instance, really does require that in a certain sense we replicate the thinking process individually so that these doctrines really are the ones that we believe and are convinced of from the heart. So that's every generation. But you're right. Has it fallen on hard times? Even in the confessional world, to say nothing of kind of evangelicalism outside of that tradition, undoubtedly it has. And I could speculate. I do in the book, All That Is in God. I could bore you with my speculations as to sort of what lies at the roots of that. But I think some of it, if I could just point it out in a kind of maybe non-exact way, but I do think that there is generally in the West, after sort of Descartes and Kant as sort of the beginnings and ends of what we call modernity proper, there is a kind of collapse of any confidence in the knowledge of metaphysics. And I want to be careful. I'm not suggesting classical Christian theism is really just metaphysics, but I mean that the way of thinking that is distinctly metaphysical historically helped the church to say what God is not. So I'll take something like impassibility as an example. If impassibility means God's without passions, then there has to be some way in which being passionate isn't proper for God. And then that means there has to be something conceptual that it means to, a passion needs to mean something, and it needs to mean something that when read against the very being and activity of God doesn't fit. But if passions are really just sort of statements about our emotional state of frame of mind, and passions aren't really metaphysical properties or historically what were called accidents, because we're not even sure that substance accident distinction means anything anymore, then historically what a lot of Christians, East, West, Protestant, Catholic, meant when they said that God is impassible, sort of, it's not that we now oppose it, it's we don't actually quite understand anymore what they were denying. What was this thing? What was this possession of passions that was unbecoming of the Creator? But again, if you don't have a basic kind of substance accident distinction, and then even why possessing passions, which would be an accident, would make God a dependent entity. If that doesn't have any kind of conceptual purchase in your mind, then it's easy to just kind of let that language sort of, you don't banish it, you just kind of sideline it, so to speak, and it goes over there, and in through disuse and through loss of the conceptual structure, it begins to be meaning, or worse, words that sound wrong to the more modern way of thinking. You can say that with other things too. Immutability as well, strict immutability, as opposed to like ethical constancy. And so modernity will come to immutability and say, well, it doesn't mean that God can't change it absolutely. It just means that he can't change with regard to his promises or purposes. There are certainly texts in scripture that say those kinds of things. But then we allow a kind of becoming in the very being of God. And so these are ways in which the historic classical view sort of gets perhaps loosened up or lost in our modern ways of thinking. And I want to be careful not to say that there's some kind of high-handed, sinister movement afoot in which I don't have a conspiracy theory approach to why it's ailing. I have my theory is a little bit more of I think we lost the ability to think in metaphysical categories, which meant that denials of things that presuppose the knowledge of metaphysics as kind of a backdrop just stopped having the same kind of intellectual meaning to us that it used to have. I don't know if that's a way to that's kind of a high altitude summary of what modernity has done to us. But
a loss of understanding philosophy in general attributes to it then.
Yeah, and it's not that philosophy is true. I mean, I dislike all philosophy is false except for the philosophy that isn't. And what we, you can say the same thing about theology. And what we should say is the kind of general that philosophy could be a handmaiden. Philosophy, particularly metaphysics, which studies being, can be, if it's studied, if it's understood rightly, if right reason is actually understanding truths about things, then that kind of language and conceptuality can be pressed into the service of theology. And I think there's a fear sometimes that, for instance, classical Christian theism is trying to use metaphysics to box God into some like Aristotelian, cell. We're just going to lock him down into this. And the language of substance and accidents, and even of act and potency, and all these different sort of metaphysical principles certainly is taken over very largely from Neoplatonism and Aristotelianism. But in fact, when I read a medieval like Thomas Aquinas, or an 18th century Baptist like John Gill, who's saying a lot of the exact same things as Aquinas, using the exact same language as Aquinas, what I actually read them doing is they're making often a series of denials. They're negating certain things about God. So if you take the doctrine of simplicity, maybe we can talk about that at more length. But if you take the doctrine of simplicity, what the doctrine of simplicity is not a doctrine. When simplicity says that God is not composed of parts. And then Aquinas will do something like he'll look at 6 different models in which ways in which a thing can be composed of parts. So material bits, a composition of material bits, a composition of form and matter, a composition of subject and nature. So subject would be like John, nature would be like the humanity in virtue of which John is a man. And then we can distinguish between humanity and John because John's a particular man, but not all humanity. And so there's some kind of composition in John between that which individuates him as this man, as opposed to that which he shares in common with Colt, J, and James. So these so Aquinas will kind of run through all these ways in which creatures can be composed of substance and of accidents, of form and of matter, of body parts. And what he ends up doing is he ends up showing how each of those really is a structure of being that requires finitude in its subject. It requires a bit bounding a bit, if I can put it most basically. Something is something is giving act, something is receiving and bounding the act that is given. And when Aquinas runs through all of those kind of typical Aristotelian categories, although there is an atypical one in there, there's his existence essence, when he says that God isn't composed of existence and essence, that he is and what he is aren't composed in him. That in that case, he's really going beyond anything Aristotle ever said. But when he runs through that list of Aristotelian style composition models, what he's really interested in is emphasizing that God can't be located anywhere in that schema. But here's the thing about that schema. If you don't know that scheme, if you don't have a knowledge of why it requires finitude, then it becomes very difficult to keep God out of the scheme. And I think this is what happens. We end up thinking of God as finite because we don't really understand the structures of finitude. So, like, if Christians today, most Christians, I've not come across a Christian yet who says, "Yeah, I serve a finite God. I serve a finite God." I mean, most Christians are still comfortable. I mean, John, to your point earlier, John, I mean, has it fallen on hard times? Yes, but also some of the language and the commitments are still sort of out there in the mouths of Christians, and I think they mean it. But when I say God is infinite, for instance, I'm making a denial. I'm denying finitude. And so then the question comes up, well, what constitutes finitude? Not what is a finite thing. Birds and grass and trees and humans and clouds and planets, these are all finite things. Don't point to a finite thing. Point to the structure of the thing that renders it finite. In other words, why not don't point to something that is finite. Tell me what it is about the thing that makes it finite. Does that make sense? And this is what Aquinas is doing, like with the doctrine of simplicity. He's looking through all the different ways that things can be compounded, because composition is, in fact, for him, the structure of finitude. That is, you're going to find finitude in some kind of composition of bits, whether they are metaphysical or physical. And then he sort of outlines 6 ways in which a thing can be constituted finite, and then he systematically denies every one of those of God. And so, far from sort of putting God into an Aristotelian category, he's actually running through a series of Aristotelian categories, emphasizing and stressing why God can't possibly be contained in it. Does that make sense? I think the idea isn't that he's trying to put God in an Aristotelian box. He's actually trying to keep you from putting God in an Aristotelian box unwittingly. So he's kind of spelling it out, why God can't fit into this category of finitude and that category of finitude, and then another like that. So classical Christian theism does deal a lot in negations, what used to be called the via negativa. And we can hear this even in our modern language. When we say that God is infinite, not finite, or immortal, not mortal, or immutable, not changeable, there are all sorts of what God is nots that are part of an Orthodox Christian confession of God. And really, classical Christian theism tends to just sort of work that out in some detail for us. And that's really what it's endeavored. Using philosophy, to your point, Jay, using a sound philosophy as a handmaiden to ensure that we don't locate God as one of the items within the philosophy itself. I think that's important to recognize. We're not boxing God up. We're working through all the ways in which he could be boxed up to emphasize that he can't be boxed up. And maybe that's a way to think of it.
Well, I think Jay's got to leave here pretty quick. So, Jay, do you have any big questions that you want to ask before you?
Well, I want to have him back on to talk about the problem of evil now, with the language of negation and.
Well, that helps us, doesn't it? It helps us navigate that deep mystery. Mm-hmm. But maybe we could talk a little bit of simplicity if you want.
Yeah, we do.
We do want to do that. Yep. What is simplicity?
What is it? Go ahead and set me up for something if you want. I don't want to just spew everything I want to say about simplicity at once. But
well, let me just start it this way. I was in a Sunday school class, and the subject was about the attributes of God, the perfections of God, and somehow we got into this conversation about God being simple, and somebody made the comment, "Boy, nothing we've talked about in this entire Sunday school class has been simple. God does not change. These things are not simple concepts. So what do we mean by divine simplicity then? If that's
that's it. Okay, that's a
important?
great question. And I think the first thing we want to say is it doesn't mean easy to understand. Maybe that's the first thing we should put out there.
First
I mean,
negation.
it's kind of one of those theology. There's a book. I mean, I don't like the book, but it's an enviable title. If you're going to critique simplicity, Christopher Hughes wrote a book in 1989 called "On a Complex Theory of a Simple God." And I thought, well, that was low hanging fruit, if you're going to critique simplicity. And there is something about it to actually this, though. First of all, we're not saying that God is easy to understand. And we should also say this. We're not saying that our thoughts or our language about God are simple. In fact, I'll just give you an example. The statement, for instance, Colt, God is simple, is not a simple statement about God. It's a complex composite statement about simplicity. There's a subject, there's a predicate, and there's a verb joining them together. I mean, at least there you've got three parts of speech. Even in the statement God is simple isn't a simple statement. I mean, right? So let's just kind of start there. But what we're not talking about is we're not talking about the manner of our thinking about God or the manner of our talking about God. The manner of our thinking and the manner of our speaking are multi-parted. All I've ever said, I mean, I've talked about simplicity a good bit over the years, and I've only ever said multi-parted things about the simple God. And so we're definitely not talking about the way in which we say it. We're really talking about the manner of his being. And what we're saying is that the manner of his being is such that he's not composed of parts. And if we really want to get down to the basic claim of simplicity, it's that God's being is not composed of parts. Now, this will raise questions like, what is a part? This is how I've tried to boil it down most simply. A part is anything in a subject or in an entity that is less than the whole and without which the whole would be really different than it is. And I think that is going to fit metaphysical parts, physical parts. That's going to fit essential parts and accidental parts. So like an accidental part would be an accidental part would be something like speaking, for instance. Right now, I'm speaking, which is an action, but I'm a human who is speaking, but I could stop speaking and I would still be a human, but I wouldn't have the state of being, which is speaking. So I would lose the actuality of speaking if I fell silent. And so there's a certain sense in which that's a part, in as much as there's James the human, but then there's James the human speaking, and James the human speaking is actually more complex than just James the human. It's James the human plus a state of being over and above being human. So being human and speaking aren't identical, because the three of you aren't speaking right now and you haven't lost your humanity, in which case then being human and then being a human who speaks. So speaking, for instance, is an accidental feature over and above. And what we're saying with regard to God is that there aren't states of being in God that are in a certain sense fortuitous to him, so that there's not God and then plus states of being over and above God that God acquires or takes on, because that would require that God be finite, meaning it's because I'm not infinite fullness of being that I have to actualize certain potential in myself in order to do or be certain things. To be a husband, I have to enter into marriage vows. To be a father, I have to beget offspring. To speak, I have to open my mouth and pass air over my vocal cords. To take a nap, I don't need to do much for that anymore. Just kind of sit still for a minute and I can get there. But in other words, I have to add states of being to myself to kind of get into these other conditions, because I'm not infinite fullness of being. I'm a finite entity who is becoming as I move through different sort of what we call accidental states of being. Well, that's one example. So then you would have a substantial part, which would be me, and then you would have the accidents, which are something over and above me that actualize me into some action or experience or something like that. So we're saying that God is without parts, but I want to get to this, Colt, because I think there's actually something in the very sort of heart of this doctrine of simplicity that is deeply intuitive in the heart of most Christians, which is this. If I were to ask the average Christian, does God, let me say something about parts and wholes, and then I'll ask my question. We should say that anything composed of parts depends upon its parts somehow. Now, I depend upon certain parts, but they're not essential to me. And then there are other things I depend upon, like my soul and my body. Those are of my essence. But my sitting, which is an accident of position, or my speaking, which is an accident of action, there are certain things in me that are essential, certain things that are not essential. But in any case, my whole depends upon my parts. And that's actually how wholes are. All wholes have some kind of dependency relationship upon the parts of which they are comprised, either essentially dependent or accidentally dependent. But either way, there's some kind of dependency relation going on in every part-whole relation. All right, so to the question, does God depend on what is not himself in order to be? And I mean, in any way that I say God is, in order to be. And I think most Christians would say, no. If that's your response, then in a certain sense, you are already committed to classical Christian theism and to the very heart of divine simplicity itself. The rest is really just details. Everything else we say in simplicity after that is really just a mechanism for protecting that commitment, that God does not depend on what is not God to be God. And I think if we can say this, every whole depends on what is not, every whole that's composed of parts depends on what is not itself to be itself. That's how wholes relate to their parts. Parts fund the being of wholes. Wholes depend upon the parts. If a wheel falls off of my car, I had a flat tire yesterday, and I need 4 inflated tires to drive well. My minivan did not cease to be a minivan just because the tire was flat, but it lost the well-being of minivan. Does that make sense? In other words, there was something of if you ask me the question, is, putting the emphasis on is here, is your minivan ready to drive? Is your minivan suitable for transportation? We had to get the kids to school. Is your minivan suitable for transportation? When I wake up in the morning and I have a flat tire, the answer is no. What happened? Something went wrong with one of the parts. And when something went wrong with one of the parts, the whole actually lost something good. So that wholes depend upon their parts. Some of those parts are essential. If you took the wheels off my car, it wouldn't even be a car. Some of them are accidental. If the air condition goes out in my car, it can still be a car, but it's just less comfortable to drive around. So, but either case, if you lose a part, you lose some state of being. I think that's what I want to emphasize. Parts give states of being, either accidental or essential, depending on the kind of part that they are. If God were composed of parts, and we should also emphasize that parts as such are not identical to wholes, otherwise they would just be wholes. I hope that's not too complex. I think if the thing were a whole, it wouldn't be. A part is always somehow inferior to the whole, always somehow inferior to the whole, and always non-identical with the whole. So if God were composed of parts, we would have to say there's something in God, not God, upon which God depends in order to be God. I am very happy to say that about myself. I am comprised of a soul and a body. My soul and my body are irreducible constituents of my nature. If you reduce me down to each other, my body isn't a bit of soul, and my soul is not a bit material. I have an immaterial part and a material part that are constituted together, constitute me Aristotle would have called me a rational animal. These are essential parts. They are irreducible to each other, but neither of them as such is a human, properly speaking. A human body without a soul isn't a man. A human soul without its body is in an imperfect and incomplete state. In fact, Christians long for resurrection because we want to be saved in our complete humanity. So there's a sense in which I depend upon parts, not myself. My soul is a distinct part from my body. Both of them are more basic and fundamental than I, who am composed of them. You could even say that, although it gets a little more difficult, even about angels, where angels, if you take the view that they are pure spirits, that's the majority view among Protestants anyway, and a debated view among medievals. I take the side that they are immaterial, pure spirits. But even they are not composed of parts. They are composed of parts, not exactly the way we are. They might not exhibit body-soul composition because they don't have bodies, properly speaking, according to their nature. But they do exhibit other kinds of composition, like substance accident, meaning if the will of an angel can change, and we should say, like with Satan and the fallen angels, they move from a state of goodwill to bad will. Okay, so that there was a mutation in their will, and yet they remained the same angel, in which case an accidental state of will, a perverted one, was acquired, and a good state of will was lost. That they lost the actuality of goodwill, and they gained the state of perverse will. And so even they are composed of substance and accidents. We could also say, most basically, that angels are composed of existence and essence. What an angel is and that an angel is are not identical. It's a being that has existence, but it's not identical with its existence. So even in this regard, so if composition really is the structure of finitude, you can make the case that anything composed of parts is necessarily finite somehow, existentially at least. In other ways, beyond existentially, formally, when your soul is contracted to your matter, then even more so. But all of these are contractions. These compositions are models of contraction. Back to the question of the divine being. But if the divine being were composed of parts, then something more fundamental than God himself would be in God, constituting him or causing him to be. And again, I would want to insist that most Christians, even those that are relatively theologically untaught, who've never heard of the doctrine of simplicity or thought through its implications, I think most Christians are already in their heart of hearts deeply committed to this reality that God does not depend on what is not himself to be himself. Simplicity is just a way, again, of kind of heading off all those ways in which we might be tempted to compromise that core Christian conviction. Does that make sense? So, Colt, to your question, not easy to understand, not suggesting that, but in a certain sense, easy to believe, though. To believe that the one from whom and through whom and to whom are all things, the one who made all things and all things exist by his will, to believe that he does not depend on what is not himself to be himself, I think that's every Christian who believes that God is the absolute creator of heaven and earth already is committed to that. Simplicity is just a way of really preserving and ensuring that we don't let go of that commitment. And I would submit to John's point earlier, has this fallen on hard times? I think by losing our understanding of how composition requires finitude, and also losing our understanding of the many ways in which things could be constituted composite, by losing our notion of composition, the meaning of divine simplicity has been sort of hollowed out. It's not that we deny it, it's that we're not even exactly sure what we were supposed to be saying by it. If that makes sense. So I got into this years ago, maybe not anticipating this, but sort of realizing I think I'm the one who's, I'm just part of that generation, maybe several generations that have kind of lost access to this way of thinking and speaking.
So then the attributes of God, then that's God. That's who he is then.
Yeah.
Right.
So we can think of it like this. Like I'll pick a few attributes. I'll pick godlike attributes that a Christian might exhibit. Love. I'll just pick love, justice, and wisdom. Okay. So that in the image of God, we can exhibit the attributes of love, justice, and wisdom. But in me, love and justice and wisdom are all accidents, which is to say, I can be me and not loving. And so I should say, to the extent that I am loving, I should say James has love. To the extent that I'm wise, which would only be by God's gift and kindness, but I would say I have wisdom. And we've all seen people who for a while seem to be walking in wisdom, and then darkness kind of settled on their heart and they lost their way and began to walk a different path away from us. So I have wisdom, I have love. What was the other one I said? Justice. Oh, justice, giving to each what is due him. I can have the virtue of justice. I can have the quality of wisdom, the quality of mind and heart that is wisdom. I can have the quality of heart and mind that is love, but there's a certain sense in which I possess these as attributes really distinct from me. I'm a subject who has these things, but I'm not identical with these things. So I have love, and that love is that in virtue of which I love. I have some wisdom from God. It's that in virtue of which I'm wise. But here's what we want to say about God. When it comes to God, though, we don't want to think of him properly speaking, though improper. We can say this in an imprecise way. It's okay that God has wisdom, has love, has justice. But what we can say even more deeply is, but he doesn't have them as something not himself, as something distinct from him somehow. Rather, God just is his own love. And we get this in 1 John when he says God is love. But we should say the same with justice. God just is a consuming fire of holiness. He doesn't have justice. He is the very justice. He is the very righteousness, so to speak, by which we call him just. He is his own love, by which we call him love. He is his own wisdom, so that God doesn't have wisdom. He is wisdom itself. So that in God, the attributes are not something distinct from him that sort of build him up. That's how it is in creatures. We should say that God really just is all his attributes, so that God's love really is just God. God's wisdom really is just God. Now, we use that multi-parted way of speaking because we derive our ways of thinking and speaking about God from the ways in which he images forth himself in creation and ways he speaks of himself in human language in Scripture. So our knowledge of God, which sort of passes through the creaturely language and the creaturely refraction of his glory, might speak about God as having love or having power. But properly speaking, we should understand that God doesn't have it as something not himself, but rather God, all that is, well, maybe I'll just take a line, the most unoriginal line with me ever. All that is in God just is God. So I titled my second book, All That Is in God, and people say, wow, that's an ambitious title, but it's a small book, big title. But my point is, if you look through the tradition, everybody everywhere used to say that there's nothing in God, not God. And so we can't say, so you can say, like, is James identical with his love? And the answer is no, because James without his love is a totally conceivable thing, just ask those who know me best. They could tell you, this is James without his wisdom. Oh yeah. That's a real thing. And so I possess these as gifts. God doesn't possess them as gifts or attributes distinct from himself. They just are God. And these are the ways in which we can speak about God. But that in virtue, if we can put it like this, that in virtue of which God is loving is not an attribute he has. It's the being he is. And so what we should say is God loves in virtue of being God. God hates iniquity. Let's call that justice, in virtue of being God. God is merciful and kind in virtue of being God. In other words, he doesn't have the quality of mercy. He doesn't have the attribute of wisdom. We should just say he just is all these things that we attribute to him as attributes. And maybe it's proper, John, that we call them attributes, because that really kind of gets to what we're doing is we are taking names from human language and experience that reflect something of the glory of God, and we are attributing those names to God. What we're trying to be careful not to do, though, is suggest that the way God has the attributes is somehow modally identical to the way that creatures made in his image have those godlike attributes. The manner of his having, that's really it. The manner of his having is not composite, it's simple. Otherwise, there'd be something in him, not identical with him, constituting him somehow. I don't know. Does that kind of come to your point?
Yeah, that's really good. So I have one more follow-up question then. So
Sure.
for the, Colt and I are pastors. So for the people in our, that we minister to and the lay people listening in, how important is this for people to understand, the simplicity of God and to hold and to defend?
I think it is. I think it is very important. But I think the place where you need to start, particularly with the layperson, is the lay Christian needs to be convinced that he or she is already, insofar as they believe that God is the one from whom and through whom and to whom are all things. If they believe that, and a Christian believes that. Let me just say, a Christian believes that.
Yeah.
It starts with affirming that commitment. And then insofar as you begin to build in an understanding of simplicity, make it very clear that what you're doing is you're trying to prevent any loss of that commitment. And I think that's where before you start getting into structures of composition, before you go there, I think some very basic understanding that God can't depend on what is not identical with himself to be himself. I think most Christians are already very deeply committed to that, even if they've never thought it in those terms in their minds. And then show that, and then kind of make a general observation that everything that is built up or composed of parts depends somehow on its parts. And the easiest way to illustrate that I have found is with sort of physical artifacts. And so you can use the illustration of a car. When I teach this to undergraduates, I take a picture of a car that I found online, a picture of a car in which the frame and every single part of the car has actually been taken out of it and laid side by side on the floor of a shop. And they realize that every single one of these, the come way on every single one of these parts, and nothing in this picture is a car. When you put them all together, you'll have a car, which means the car depends on what is not a car to be a car. I mean, I would say, so much as you're comfortable, particularly in a Sunday school class, using a visual like that and then kind of working a negative thought experiment off of it and saying, but if this is how God is, then something not God is in there causing God to be somehow. And remind them that that's cutting against their very core conviction that God doesn't require or depend on what isn't himself to be himself. So there are ways. I mean, I guess the challenge for me, John, was teaching some Sunday school classes and then also teaching sort of 20-year-old college students for many years, thinking, how am I going to say this kind of medieval, early Reformation thing in a world where this whole way of thinking has sort of, no pun intended, I don't do puns, but I'll do one, has sort of fallen apart. I mean, the whole notion of composition has in a certain sense gone to pieces because we don't think that way clearly anymore. I think there are ways though to get in there, but it starts with affirming what the core commitment of the doctrine is and show them that when they trust God as the absolute creator and sustainer of heaven and earth, that they're already on board. And as soon as they feel some vested interest, and those who are listening to the podcast, I hope you do feel an invested interest in this. I hope a vested interest. I hope you do feel like, you know what? I don't want to lose that commitment. The doctrine of simplicity and sort of working through non-composition is one of the ways in which we maintain and hold together that commitment from the ways we might be inclined to start to lose it. So I think maybe that doesn't tell you how to do a 5-week series on simplicity, but at least tells you how to get through the first day. How to use for what it's worth.
I think that was extremely helpful. I was going to ask a very similar question. Why does all of this matter? I mean, one of the things that I would anticipate in a Sunday school class is, why do we have to think so deeply about these things? Why? And I think the way you explained simplicity, just boiling it down to God does not depend on what is not God to be God, is so important. And another takeaway that I had is just the whole discussion of classical theism, how, this isn't just one little small segment that's being traced. This is a broad understanding of who God is throughout, which in my mind would point to the fact that this is probably a very biblical understanding, if this is the way that Christians have largely understood this. And I think that's what a lot of people would understand. And I say all that to ask this: if that's the case, are there, you say it's fall on some hard times? Who are some people that might oppose simplicity the way you've defined it today? People that are out there, and why is that
that's
important?
An interesting question. The opposition probably comes in several forms, and some of the opposition probably it wouldn't necessarily be aware of itself as opposition. And I think I want to be careful not to attribute will where a theological mistake that isn't willful or high-handed certainly can be made. If I could name those that are like explicitly opposed to it, probably all varieties of open theism would be opposed to divine simplicity. I'll give you, the names from the previous generation would have been guys like the late Clark Pinnock, the philosopher William Hasker, some of the guys out of Bethel up up in Minnesota would be opposed to the kind of the open theist crowd as you think about
Like
all
Greg
of the theism.
Boyd. Yeah.
Greg Boyd, yeah, that's the name I was going for up there. Greg Boyd would certainly be just openly opposed to it. Older process theologians, guys like Charles Hartshorne in the middle of the 20th century, would have been vociferously opposed to divine simplicity. The philosopher William James opposes divine simplicity, not on the basis of it being theoretically wrong, but of it having no practical value. And so for him, because he's the father of pragmatism, William James. And so if I can't do anything with this knowledge, then it's not that it's wrong. It's that who cares? And so that's that's another kind of a pragmatic way of opposing it is this doesn't change the way I live. Although I would argue he's right. It's not practical. That doesn't, for that reason, mean that it doesn't have practical implications. I could talk about that in a second. So kind of process theism, Alfred Whitehead would be opposed to it. Others as well. More recently, guys like John Peckham would be opposed to it up in Michigan. Thomas J. Oord would be very strongly opposed to it in the modern literature. These are guys that are writing books with IVP and Baker and kind of mainstream evangelical academia who are quite strongly opposed to this. I think where it gets, and I think the one thing I appreciate about all those guys is they're just right out there, open and clear why they disagree and what they think the alternative is. I think the alternative is not sufficiently Christian and needs to be opposed. And there are people out there, guys like Stephen Doobie, who are opposing it. And I'm mentioning Doobie here as somebody who's very good on the doctrine of divine simplicity in the Protestant world today. But I think where it gets a little more difficult are the implicit ways in which we lose divine simplicity. And we don't necessarily think about divine simplicity or think that we're opposing it. We just sort of begin to speak about God in ways that inevitably do have that effect. And interestingly, that's not just that's just not the prerogative of evangelicals. There are certain modern Catholics who kind of run that same route where they begin to implicitly deny the doctrine, even though as Catholics, they're supposed to believe it. But perhaps one that has had a huge influence in the Calvinistic world would be someone like Bruce Ware. I'm not sure that Bruce Ware has a place where he openly opposes divine simplicity. At least if he does, I don't recall it or haven't seen it. But certainly when Bruce Ware speaks about God's changing emotional life, he would have to have a doctrine of God composed of substance and accidents in order to have creatures act on God in such a way as new states of emotion entered into him. And Ware is very clear that these new states of emotion are in God and that the creatures are the ones who are causing them. Now, he will say God sovereignly chose it to be that way. And so he'll kind of use sovereignty to kind of shore up the fact that he doesn't believe strictly in immutability. That's not a late aberration, though, in Ware. That is the thesis of his 1984 doctoral dissertation at Fuller. I mean, he is arguing in 1984 that we need to revise the doctrine of immutability to allow room for God to undergo emotive changes vis-a-vis his creatures. So that's a career project for him. And yet, I think what he's not so attacking classical immutability, he does that pretty clear-headedly. That's an objective of his for a long time. The implications for simplicity, he seems to be less conversant with those implications. Necessarily, if there are new states of mind or emotion in God that are caused in God by himself or by the creature, then God has to be composed of principles of act and of passive potency just for that proposal to make any sense at all. And so that would be like an example where I don't think there's he openly wants to revise and retool divine immutability. Necessarily, though, he's going to have to dispense with the classical doctrine of simplicity just to pull it off. Is he aware that he has to do so? I can't say that he is. Is it a necessary implicate of his project? Yes. It has to be sort of pushed aside. But again, he's writing a lot of that stuff in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. And frankly, not a lot of people, right? I mean, nowadays people talk about we're beginning to talk about simplicity again, which I think is wonderful. But during those years, it's not like there was a contingency within the Reformed or Calvinistic or evangelical world insisting on simplicity and pointing that out to Ware while he was sort of proposing his retooling of immutability. So there's a sense in which a lot of this has kind of gone on unchecked. But there is, at least in the last maybe 15 or 20 years, there's been something of a revival of sorts of familiarity with 17th century texts and 16th century texts, in which if you open up a 16th or 17th century text of theology, you're going to find a very strong adherence to divine simplicity sort of right out there in the open. Kind of recovery, that rediscovery has kind of reintroduced older theological concepts to conservative Calvinistic evangelicals, and it's giving us tools to look at a project like Bruce Ware's and ask some questions about it that for the last 30 years haven't really been asked. But that would be so. Colt, my point there is, I do think he wants to retool immutability. He has to dispense with simplicity. Does he know that he has to? I'm not convinced he does. But nevertheless, if his project's going to be maintained, he'll have to do that. So that would be an example. I don't think you'll get the same thing a little bit in D.A. Carson. When D.A. Carson kind of obliquely, not obliquely, it's quite explicit in his little book, The Difficult Doctrine of the Love of God, where he swats at the impassibility doctrine. I mean, it's a little snarky. That's okay. Those were lectures. I'll give some leash on some lectures. Like he wanted to be punchy. He has some pretty punchy things to say about those who hold to divine impassibility. What I think he doesn't understand is there's no way that he gets to have a little passibility and maintain divine simplicity. He won't be able to hold those things together. Probably the same thing in Wayne Grudem. Right. Wayne Grudem's section on simplicity in his first edition of his Systematics it's a pretty nice, orthodox, straightforward articulation of the doctrine. But then a little while later in the same theology, he attacks the doctrine of divine impassibility as being unbiblical. And it makes me suspect that Grudem hasn't really connected the dots, that if God can undergo passions, then he has to be composed of substance and accidents, because passions are one of Aristotle's 9 category of accidents. So when you're going to attribute a category of accidents to God, you don't get to say he's simple anymore, because now he's composed of substance and accident, which is one of the categories of composition that historically divine simplicity was designed to deny. So I wonder, like, for instance, that clearly isn't high-handed. It's just that I don't think that Grudem, for instance, has quite thought through the implications of simplicity, because other positions he takes in his systematic require that you dispense with divine simplicity. So those are the examples. I think some of those are more overtly, the open theists, the process theists are overtly hostile to it. Yeah. Some of the conservative evangelical types are less overtly hostile to it. They just kind of undo it indirectly. I guess that'd be the way to say it.
Yeah, you said a few minutes ago that there were when you're talking about pragmatism, it doesn't. Some people would say, well, we deny it because it doesn't matter, doesn't do anything for my life. But you said there were some implications. Would you just talk about that for a minute?
Well, what I mean by, I'm okay saying it's not a practical doctrine if, in a very narrow sense, if by practical doctrine you mean a doctrine that tells me how to. If that's what you mean by, so in the Middle Ages and in the Reformation period, there were all these debates about whether theology is speculative or practical. And virtually, although they will debate the balance, almost everyone agrees, Protestants and medieval Catholics, that it's partly speculative. That's a word we don't like anymore, but it deserves a second chance, because it really means contemplation and contemplation of the truth and gazing upon God and his glory as we contemplate him in his revelation. But they would say partly speculative, partly practical. Some of our doctrines are how to. I mean, there are practical implications to the doctrine of sanctification about putting to death the flesh and putting on Christ Jesus. The doctrine of God, I want to say, does not fit within practical, though I want to talk about the implications of it for practice. It doesn't fit within practical because the doctrine of God is actually something that is not the end of the doctrine of God is the knowing and the enjoying of God, not some behavioral modification. There are certain doctrines and certainly aspects of law, of biblical law, and especially commands about loving our neighbors and even worshiping God that have practical implications. But the knowledge of God is, in a certain sense, its own reward. It's not knowledge for how to, it's knowledge to enjoy. It's not utilitarian in any respect. It is an end in itself, just simply to be delighted in. But I would say this with regard to simplicity. If you want some practical implications, I think one of the, and both of you asked earlier, John and Colt and Jay, we asked about whether what this means for the average Christian, maybe the Christian in the Sunday school class who wants to know why does this, is there a great, are we at risk of losing something important if we lose this? And I think we are. And it's not just that we lose the right idea of God. It's that God really, really means that we are casting ourselves upon him most fundamentally and ultimately. When I trust God, if God were composed of parts, my trust in God would, in a certain sense, have to extend down below God to the foundations of his own being, which is how parts relate to wholes. So that I couldn't just trust God, I would really have to trust all the things upon which God depended as well. Does that make sense? And so, like, if I get in my car, I don't just trust my minivan. I've also got to have some confidence in the fuel injectors and in the axles and in the tires. And like, if I want my car to do what it does, moving me about, I've got to depend on not just my car, but everything upon which my car itself depends. But if we are supposed to cast ourselves wholly upon God and depend on him without reservation and not get deeper than God in our confidence and in our trust, then this doctrine of simplicity really speaks of his irreducibility, of his absolute fundamentality. And it also says that if God is not composed of parts, then, and I don't mean to be cute about it, but then he's not going to fall apart on you. Why is God dependable? Because he doesn't have the potential to be undone. Or to put it a little differently, God won't fall apart because he was never composed of parts in the first place. Or to put differently, there are no parts into which he might fall. Does that like, if you take me, if I say, hey, Colt, trust me, and then, I give you a promise tomorrow afternoon, trust me, I'm going to do this thing, and then I get hit by a train and I'm gone and I shove off this mortal coil and you mourn my loss, but I'm not here anymore. And there's a certain sense in which the union of my soul and body, having in the interim been dissolved, shall we say, by the train that hit me, I'm not there anymore for you to trust. I have fallen apart. Literally, the composition of soul and matter have now been disengaged, and your trust in me might have been provisionally okay. But the thing is, what you really needed to trust was the union of my parts upon which I was depending just to be me. So if that makes, hopefully that makes some sense. Part of our confidence in God, part of that absolute abandon that we have when we cast ourselves upon him is due to the fact that God does not depend upon something more fundamental than himself. Why trust God absolutely and unreservedly? Because there's nothing more absolute in being. But if he were composed of parts, that wouldn't be true. That wouldn't be true. So I think that's one practical implication of this. You can trust God with abandon and absolutely, because there is no possibility that God is going to go to pieces on you, because that's not how God is God. He's not a God of pieces or a God of parts. He's a God without parts.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. I didn't think of that. So, well, we've been talking here for well over an hour, and
I could do this all day and it would just be insufferable. So maybe we should wind it. Thank you guys. I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, we could too.
Yeah, and we really appreciate your time. This has been really good and helpful. I'm going to send it to my Bible study there, my Sunday school class, and see if they can say, hey, it is supposed to be a little complicated, but it's important.
No, it's okay. And I actually think that Christians don't mind. I've found this over the years. Christians don't mind being challenged to think deeply about their God. I mean, at first they might kind of recoil, but there's something thrilling about the thought that we can contemplate God deeply, and we can say, yes, things that are strange and unlike what we say about creatures, but that the thought of God can sustain this kind of contemplation and give us wonders to contemplate and to think about and to share with others, is a really thrilling prospect.
Yeah. Yeah, I liked how you talked about the finite. God is not finite, but yet sometimes inadvertently I think we think of him, and we need to guard against that. So really stuff here when it comes to the doctrine of God and who God is and how we seek to understand. So thank you so much for being with us, and maybe we'll on again, like Jay said. So John, any closing thoughts there?
Thanks so much.
Questions?
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you. I really enjoyed my time, and appreciate you having me on.
Thanks.